When the Jews at Corinth hardened their hearts against the Lord, Paul said to them, "Your blood be on your own heads. I am clean. From now on I will go to the Gentiles." He didn't continue to argue with them in the synagogue. He moved to the house of Justus, who was next door, and took the believers with him, and established the local assembly in Corinth, separate from the synagogue. But it's interesting, the phrase, "your blood be on your own heads." He is, of course, referring to the fact that because the Jewish people had crucified the Lord Jesus and persisted in rejecting him as the Messiah, great judgment was coming upon them, as the Lord Jesus had taught. But as yet, that judgment hadn't fallen. That judgment would fall on Jerusalem in AD 70, when Titus would come and besiege the city and destroy the temple. And so the Jewish people would be exiled and hounded among the nations again until recent times. Paul spent 18 months in Corinth, and from there ministered to the whole of Greece, encouraging the believers in every place. And so a large church was established there. Many of the Corinthians, hearing, believed and were baptized. Paul remained there a good while. Then he took leave of the brethren and sailed for Syria, and Priscilla and Aquila were with him. He had his hair cut off at Cenchrea, for he had taken a vow, and he came to Ephesus, and left them there. But he himself entered the synagogue and reasoned with the Jews. When they asked him to stay a longer time with them, he did not consent, but took leave of them, saying, "I must by all means keep this coming feast in Jerusalem. But I will return again to you, God willing." And he sailed from Ephesus. And when he had landed at Caesarea and gone up and greeted the church, he went down to Antioch. After he had spent some time there, he departed and went over the region of Galatia and Phrygia in order, strengthening all the disciples. Now a certain Jew named Apollos, born in Alexandria, an eloquent man and mighty in the Scriptures, came to Ephesus. This man had been instructed in the way of the Lord, and being fervent in spirit, he spoke and taught accurately the things of the Lord, though he knew only the baptism of John. So he began to speak boldly in the synagogue. When Aquila and Priscilla heard him, they took him aside and explained to him the way of God more accurately. And when he desired to cross to Achaia, the brethren wrote, exhorting the disciples to receive him. And when he arrived, he greatly helped those who had believed through grace. For he vigorously refuted the Jews publicly, showing from the Scriptures that Jesus is the Christ. My name's Arthur, and I thank you for joining me as we share together from Acts chapter 18, focusing on verses 18 to 28. So Paul completes his second missionary journey, anxious to get back to Jerusalem for the feast. Since travel at winter is very difficult, I suspect this would be the spring feast that he was seeking to be in Jerusalem for, that is, Passover. And he sees himself very much as a Jewish person. He feels very comfortable going into the synagogue. This is the place where he was trained to teach. And he is very committed to the worship of God according to the custom of the Jewish people in Jerusalem. And so, I must by all means keep this coming feast in Jerusalem, but I will return again to you, God willing. And so he is in haste. And the other thing is that he has again shown his commitment to the God of Israel by a Nazirite vow. He had his hair cut off at Cenchrea, for he had taken a vow. However, some commentators, thinking this is unworthy of Paul, suggest that it was Aquila who had his hair cut and made the vow. The idea is that you would shave your head to mark the beginning of a period of spiritual exercise, and at the end of a particular period of time, you would make the offering at the temple, giving thanks to the Lord for his grace. And Paul fully participated in this practice. Now, Caesarea was a Roman seaport and the Roman base in Palestine. And he went up to greet the church in Jerusalem and then went down to Antioch, from which he and Silas had been sent out. And so he was able to report again to the church at Antioch. And Antioch remained a major Christian missionary-focused church for some 500 years. Jerusalem could not remain as such because it was destroyed by the Romans in AD 70. But Antioch continued for 500 years until eventually Rome became the dominant place. After spending some time there, he sets out on what's known as the third missionary journey. The first focus of this is to encourage again the believers in Galatia and Phrygia. It's 2 years since he'd seen them, and he comes back to encourage them in their faithfulness to the Lord. That's the area we now know as Turkey. Meanwhile, God was using other people. There was this man Apollos from Alexandria, and we're introduced to him because he had a significant impact both in Ephesus, but most importantly in Corinth. And Apollos is one who became part of Paul's team. For we read when Paul wrote to the Corinthians that, in fact, a large section of the church stylized themselves as disciples of Apollos. Some said they were disciples of Paul, some said they were disciples of Peter, some said they were disciples of Christ himself. And Paul rejects this division of the church into groups according to particular servants. But nevertheless, he works with Apollos, and he says he urged Apollos to come and to teach them the same message that he was giving them in letter. Apollos is also mentioned in the letter to Titus, written evidently a few years later, where Paul has sent Apollos to Crete to encourage the believers. So Apollos is built into the network. And how did this happen? Well, it happened because when Apollos came to Ephesus, he was an eloquent speaker, knowledgeable in the scriptures, fervent, very keen to teach the things of the Lord, and taught them very accurately. But he was not up to date. He'd heard the message of John the Baptist, but he hadn't learned the message of the Lord Jesus. Though it's 20 years since John the Baptist was killed, yet he had followers and disciples who were still very vehement for him. In many parts of the world, his ministry had been so powerful. So Priscilla and Aquila took him aside and explained to him with more detail the scriptures relating to the Lord Jesus. He then wanted to move on to Achaia, and the believers in Ephesus wrote commending Apollos to them, so that when he arrived, he was able to greatly help the believers in Corinth. Luke was well aligned with Paul, but there's no hint of jealousy of ministry here in his account of what happened. Paul had been in Corinth and laid the foundation. Apollos came and built on that foundation. Paul sowed the seed, Apollos watered, but God gave the growth. And Apollos was very well equipped to publicly refute the Jewish claims against the Lord Jesus, showing from the scriptures that Jesus is the Christ. The issue was, these people worship God contrary to the Jewish religion, and therefore worship God contrary to the Roman law, which allows for Jews and for Romans. But Apollos could publicly argue that to believe in Jesus is indeed to pursue the teaching of the Hebrew Scriptures, showing from the Scriptures that Jesus is the Christ. This all demonstrates that the Lord loves the church. He provides the ministers for it, and that there are many people working together. That is how it was then, and that is how it is today. One sows, another waters, but God gives the increase.